Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or, if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. And they say romance is dead. William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the epitome of teenage lust and devotion, and without a doubt the singular Shakespeare piece with the most adaptations and revisits. Romeo and Juliet of the 90s, Nomeo and Juliet of the 2010s, and any other piece of media where two young lovers from rival groups of any kind long for each other against all odds. There's no denying that a play like Romeo and Juliet is iconic and enduring, but why exactly is that? It's clearly not the titular characters that make it so, being that the exact plot of the show is not the thing that's being redone. Instead, it's the idea of Romeo and Juliet that survives, the passionate declarations and undeniable feelings of love that keep the story of Shakespeare's teens hip with the kids. Wow, and just like in Shakespeare, the scenery has changed. Emily Smith puts this idea best in this article, saying that at the heart of these works are stories about love, power, betrayal, and ambition, themes as relevant now as they were in the 16th century. They just need to be presented in different/more modern ways to be accessible. Bringing the burning and tragic romance of Shakespeare plays to the screen makes these possibilities even more endless. But before I get ahead of myself talking about some of these very celebrated adaptations, we have a fundamental question to answer. What the heck makes Shakespeare so adaptable in the first place? Well, in my deep dive of research, I found that these excerpts put it best. One thing that is pretty much indestructible in Shakespeare is his sense of how to tell and angle a story by the way in which he shapes into successive scenes. In the terms used by cinema scriptwriters now, he was very skilled at making treatments as well as writing dialogue. So you can make Romeo and Juliet into a ballet, taking out all of the dialogue but leaving the scenic structure intact, and it still works. And along with that, this simple quote from David McInnes of the University of Melbourne says, "Arguably, what makes Shakespeare's work so endearing is that he doesn't provide easy answers. He doesn't tell us what to think. He teaches us how to think." So, the consensus seems to be that Shakespeare's works, as rigid and exclusive as they may seem, are actually crafted in a way that invites interpretation and adaptation. The exact plot can simply be a means of inspiration because he crafted each play with a clear overarching theme or resolution that can be found even outside of Elizabethan or ancient times. Yes, even in 1950s New York City. In my very humble opinion, the 1961 movie West Side Story, adapted from the 1957 musical of the same name, is the greatest and most impactful adaptation of Romeo and Juliet for the screen. The Lawrence, Bernstein, and Sondheim musical changed everything, and I can make a completely different video focusing purely on the musical and how phenomenal it is. But the movie, besides having only like one real brown person, takes these passionate declarations of love and puts them in a modern setting. And I mean modern even by today's standards, not just the 50s and 60s. West Side Story's Romeo, Tony, and their Juliet, Maria, represent rival groups of the streets of Upper West Side of Manhattan. They are similar to their Shakespearean counterparts in that Tony and Maria's hearts aren't totally devoted to their groups, the Sharks and Jets instead of the Capulets and Montagues. Of course, also their immediate infatuation and devotion to each other. But their story is so different because it's one of intersectionality, immigration, and most interestingly, survival on Maria's part. This change opened up a whole new world for Shakespeare screen adaptations. Filmmakers could still capture the iconic essence and sharp wit of a Shakespeare story without just retelling the same story that everybody already knows. Not only the sometimes inaccessible Shakespeare of it all, but of course, the part that most everyday people can relate to, the romance of it all. Carla Delgado writes, "West Side Story is a masterclass in adaptation. From the linguistic to the kinetic and musical, from a vague Verona setting to filming on the streets of New York, West Side Story's opening dance number does not divulge the ending that the star-crossed lovers will lose their lives, setting up a different type of storytelling from the outset and augmenting the consequences at the end." And I could not agree more. Once again, the work of the Bard inspires unique and arguably better, sorry Bard, adaptations just like West Side Story. So why stop there? It's clear that the youth are just gonna keep falling in love like the rebellious rascals that they are, and it's safe to say that even the 2000s did not forget about that. Ah, the 2000s. I remember them quite well. Rest in peace, Willie Shakespeare, you would have definitely been Team Edward. The late 90s and 2000s took typical tragic romance dramas and did something extraordinary. What if, and walk with me here, kids still fell in love like they always do, but this time, we made it kind of funny. And get this! Hear me out now. We'll even sometimes keep the Shakespeare. A romantic comedy, defined by Google, is film, literature, or theater that blends humor with a lighthearted plot centered on the development of a romantic relationship. For the rest of this video, I'm going to focus on the film part of that definition, which is definitely different from Google's definition of the romance genre, which reads, focused on the development of a romantic relationship between two people. This is exactly why movies based off of Romeo and Juliet don't typically fit into the rom-com, that's short for romantic comedy, category because they simply aren't lighthearted enough. But lucky for filmmakers, Shakespeare has like 38 other plays that they can choose from as the inspiration for the next box office hit or sleepover movie classic. So away I went on an even deeper niche dive into this wubbulous world of Shakespeare and searched for the 3 most popular romantic comedy movies that are adapted and or inspired by a William Shakespeare play. To decide on these films in the most unbiased and scientifically reliable way, I searched, quote, what are the most popular Shakespeare adaptation rom-coms, unquote. Which, now that I think about it, could have probably been worded in a more grammatically correct way, but I digress. I pressed enter and scoured every single one of the 9 articles/links that were presented to me on the first page of results. After reviewing them all, the 3 movies that were mentioned the most, and by the logic in this study, represented the most popular adaptations were Anyone But You, released in 2023, She's the Man, released in 2006, and of course, 10 Things I Hate About You, released in 1999. So yes, okay, only like one of these rom-coms is actually from the 2000s, but my point still stands. Shakespeare in the romantic comedy genre is alive and well. But now the real burning question on everyone's mind after all of this research is, which of these romantic comedies is the best Shakespeare adaptation? And in order to answer exactly that, I created a criteria of judging that would give each movie an equal playing field. Each movie will be judged on a scale of 1 to 10 in each of these 2 categories, with 1 being not at all and 10 being very much so. How true to the original play is the plot of the movie? And does the movie still fit primarily into the romantic comedy genre? And of course, naturally, more research resulted from this criterion I created for myself, and in order to reliably rate the movies in terms of these standards, I had to, number 1, watch all of these movies in their entirety, and 2, read each of the plays that each movie is based off of in its entirety. Those being Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing for Anyone But You, Twelfth Night for She's the Man, and The Taming of the Shrew for 10 Things I Hate About You. So, now that we're both clear on how this is going to play out, alloweth us finally to begin to behold each of these films individually, and findeth out which of them is the most wondrous. The rest is still unwritten. As briefly as possible and focusing mostly on the romance/key iconic Shakespeare bits and tropes, Much Ado About Nothing centers around the development of the romantic relationships between the young lovers, Hero and Claudio, and between the leads of Beatrice and Benedick, who despise each other. It's as classic as enemies to lovers can get, with the cast of characters surrounding the leads, plotting and tricking the enemies to put their hatred aside and fall in love by the end just in time for a double wedding. The play revolves around miscommunication, deception, overhearing conversations, and stubborn love that is believed to be unrequited. Now, Anyone But You takes these elements and 2023's them, and I can't say that that's a compliment. I know I'm not really supposed to be mentioning my own personal feelings about these movies or taking sides or anything, but I'll be unbiased in the ranking and the rating, so I feel like I can let this slide. This movie is so TikTokified and written so that it's always abundantly clear where people stand and what kind of character trope they're supposed to be portraying. They're all one-sided, and I'm not saying that the original characters couldn't also be defined by like one typical character trait, but wow, this movie knows it. The comic relief guy speaks Mandarin for literally no reason. The exes that got away are ridiculously hot, and that's kind of it. It's not a stimulating watch, which, sue me, is a quality that I kinda like in my rom-coms. I'm also not a big fan of unnecessary cussing in a script. Kinda like if you just learn the word and you're a 7th grader. And this movie does that a lot, which really pulls me out of enjoying the good scenes. So, okay, that's all of my opinion of this movie. The rest I'll give is just facts. Something I do really appreciate about this film and the rest of the movies that I'll be looking at today is that each of them do their best to keep the names of the original Shakespeare characters for the movie adaptation. Beatrice and Benedick become simply Bea and Ben. The names Katharina and Bianca in 10 Things are straight from the play, and the same with Duke and Viola for She's the Man. So these details gives every single movie by default a point in the Shakespeare category. So how true is Anyone But You to the plot of Much Ado About Nothing? Bea and Ben in the film do most definitely hate each other, which is key to the plot and story arc of Much Ado. Other plot points that are pretty spot on are Claudia and Hallie, which is changed from Claudio and Hero in the play, who are deeply in love, and Hallie being really closely related to Bea, so that marrying brings the two families, and in turn Bea and Ben, together. And just like in the play, there is an elaborate plot from families and friends to bring the lovebirds together and trick them into falling in love. Also, in both the play and the movie, Ben is a total bachelor, afraid of commitment, and doesn't really care about anyone or anything, which earns it some points. Bea is also mostly just standoffish and interested primarily in the happiness of Hallie/Hero. Now, the one other element of this movie that's pretty accurate to the play is the love confession between the enemies and lovers, but this movie, of course, rom-comifies it, so I think it's best to talk about it in the next category. Overall, on a scale of 1 to 10 on the Shakespeare scale, I give Anyone But You a 6. It's about half accurate to the play, with the major tropes being hit, and the other half is where it really plays into the romantic comedy side. So, does this movie primarily fit in the rom-com genre? Well, yes. Anyone But You nails the stereotypical rom-com tropes. A little too much. Especially Bea and Ben's meet cute moment. A meet cute, defined by Google, is an amusing or charming first encounter between two characters that leads to the development of a romantic relationship between them. Bea and Ben meet in Boston in a coffee shop where Bea has to use the customer's only restroom, but she isn't a customer, so Ben, at the front of the line, pretends to be her husband and says that he's buying for them both. So sweet, so silly, so rom-com. The two then spend the day and the night together, and we get to see them happy for a bit before they hate each other for a majority of the movie. This, along with a ton of other things, aren't accurate to the play, but they make the movie a romantic comedy by the Google definition I gave earlier. The extra elements like Pete existing, Jonathan existing, Margaret being Ben's old flame, all of Australia, the Titanic scene, and Ben's Serenity song keep things fun and unique, and more importantly, lighthearted, which allows this movie to count as a romantic comedy. The movie's biggest strength in this category, though, is the love confession scene. In the movie, Ben literally jumps off a cliff and flies in a helicopter to meet Bea at the Sydney Opera House, making for a typical run and go get your girl confession scene that is formulaic for a rom-com. Following the cliche rom-com genre pattern of one person in the pair listing things they love or hate, Ben says, quote, "I love the way we fight. I love how smart you are. I love the weird way you stick your hands down my pants. And I love that you don't know what you want. And if it's not me, if I don't check all your boxes, if I'm not the one, I get that. But that would really, really fucking suck." And they say romance is dead. In fact, poetic dialogue like this can probably be somehow traced back to Shakespeare or someone like him, but frankly, this assignment has taken a lot out of me, so I'll leave that research to somebody else. These iconic elements make it undeniably apparent that this movie is primarily a romantic comedy, and in my opinion, it struggles greatly in the comedy department, but I'm forced to give it a solid 7 out of 10, earning Anyone But You a strong 13 on my arbitrary scale. Let us moveth on to the next. Our only movie truly from the 2000s, She's the Man, is inspired by my favorite Shakespeare play of the three in this video, Twelfth Night. The play takes place in Illyria and centers around Viola, who, after being separated from her presumably dead twin brother Sebastian in a shipwreck, disguises herself as a man named Cesario in order to work for the Duke of Illyria, Duke Orsino, who we later find out she's deeply in love with. Duke, however, is in love with the Countess Olivia, who does not want him or any other man because she's in mourning, until Cesario comes around and steals her heart without even trying. This play is so foolish and fun, making it the perfect choice to inspire a rom-com. Duke pines after Olivia's love for almost all of the play and repeatedly sends Cesario to go to her and profess how much she and Duke are made for each other. But each time she visits, Olivia falls more and more in love with a disguised Viola, saying, "Methinks I feel this youth's perfections, with an invisible and subtle stealth to creep in at mine eyes." She is smitten at the first sight of him and believes in her heart that Cesario must be in love with her too because he keeps coming to visit. Later in the play, we find out that Sebastian is actually alive and also wants to go work for the Duke. But Olivia bumps into Sebastian in the Duke's palace and, mistaking him for Cesario, finally declares her love and asks him to marry her. Sebastian says yes, so in the final act, Olivia shows up, ready to marry who she thinks is Cesario, and Duke is pissed at Cesario, believing that he betrayed him. But Viola understands what's going on and reveals herself as Viola and not Cesario, and reveals that the whole time she's been in love with the Duke. The Duke kind of just like shrugs and says, yeah, I guess I'll love you too, and boom, end of show. There's actually an entire side plot in this play involving a character named Malvolio, but in She's the Man, Malvolio is reduced to being a tarantula, so I feel like we can skip this part. So how true to all of these points is the plot of She's the Man? Well, not very much. She's the Man gives Viola a modern reason behind disguising herself as a man and going to Illyria, which in the movie is the rival high school. She does it all because Cornwall, her school, cut the girls' soccer team, and she needs to prove that she's good enough, and she goes to Illyria to join the boys' soccer team instead. The soccer aspect of this movie is probably what strays it away from the Shakespeare the most, but it's also what makes it a great modern adaptation in a lot of other aspects, just not in the ways that I think work for the criteria that I made for myself. It's woke Shakespeare in the very best way. But regardless of that, it's definitely inaccurate. Viola disguises herself as Sebastian instead of a made-up man, which changes a lot and leads to the development of a romantic relationship between the real Sebastian and Olivia, instead of them both being left single. And of course, the whole Arachnid Malvolio thing means that a large chunk of the original play plot is left out. And yet, this movie still has a lot of points that were taken straight from the play. The major ones being the fact that Olivia still falls head over heels for a disguised Viola and pays no attention to a sensitive and insecure Duke Orsino. But pretty much everything else that happens in the movie earns it a point in the rom-com category instead. So after all of this analysis, I'm giving She's the Man a 4 out of 10 on the Shakespeare scale. But there are genuinely so many hysterical moments in this movie that give it so much strength in the next category. Being that is from 2006, it gets away with so much that probably wouldn't get it canceled or ridiculed now, but instead it solidifies it as a gem of its time. Channing Tatum as Duke has a black scent sometimes, and Viola as Sebastian does the same. But most of the time she's just kind of southern-ish, and that always kept me on my toes. The movie does have a really pleasant theme throughout about the harms of toxic masculinity and sexism, which I find adds to its impact as a classic teen movie or rom-com set in high school. She's the Man is also so quotable with lines like, "Now remember, inside every girl, there's a boy. Girls with asses like mine do not talk to guys with faces like yours. And when my eyes are closed, I see you for what you truly are, which is ugly." I'm not sure that having quotable lines makes this movie more of a rom-com, but I am sure that having potentially problematic quotable lines is a common trend of the movies of the 2000s. This movie also involved a kissing booth, which are so gross, by the way. Why were those ever a thing? Were they even real? Please, somebody make a video about the history of kissing booths. Where Duke and Viola share their meet cute. In her love confession, Viola rips off her disguise and says, "Here's the truth. I love you." And then, a theme mentioned right now for the first time, but not the last, she proceeds to flash Duke and the rest of the crowd to prove that she's actually female. And they say romance is dead. So the blending of humor with a lighthearted plot part of the romantic comedy is definitely apparent in She's the Man, but what about the romance? Well, do I have a deal for you? Because this movie ends with the development of not one, not two, but 3 romantic relationships. But this movie is still primarily about Viola's relationship with soccer, and Duke falling in love with her is just a positive result of her not giving up on soccer. But as lovey-dovey as this movie is, I think it's more about everybody finding out who they are independent of a significant other, and then finding someone who really matches them, uplifts them, their 6 sporty skills, and their love of cheese. So, on the rom-com scale, She's the Man earns a lovely 8 out of 10. Meaning, in total, the movie gets a very enthusiastic and manly 12 out of 20. I've talked a lot about the cliches or tropes of a rom-com, but haven't straightforwardly identified them and how they came about. Each one has its own history, but a lot of them can be tied completely back to Shakespeare, and Caroline Sy does a really great job of encapsulating his lasting influence on the myriad of movies. She writes, "In fact, no one has influenced the modern rom-com genre more than William Shakespeare. Though Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, it created a star-crossed lover setup that has fueled romantic comedies from Roman Holiday to Pretty Woman. Twelfth Night is the inspiration for any rom-com that involves a high-stakes hidden identity, like While You Were Sleeping, Made in Manhattan, and How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. Rosalind from As You Like It set the template for the scrappy, self-confident heroines of Working Girl and My Best Friend's Wedding. And A Midsummer Night's Dream is the urtext for any romance brimming with madcap wackiness, like Bringing Up Baby, Overboard, and Moonstruck. So just to be very clear, there are lots of other plays by the Bard that have had effects on the romantic comedy genre in general. So it's kind of funny that the second category I've made is almost a repeat of the first category. Another fun fact is that the majority of Uranus's 27 moons are named after Shakespeare characters. So his reach goes even beyond this planet. Hence we wend on to the lasteth comparison. With the utmost brevity, Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew is a story of intertwining plots, character foils, and femininity in a way. Katharina is the shrew of this story and is headstrong, outspoken, and feared by the entire male population of Padua. Her younger sister, Bianca, on the other hand, is the object of all of their affection. Problem is, though, that their father has a rule that Bianca cannot get married until Cat does. But the shrew must be tamed in order for Bianca to finally choose a suitor. And in comes Lucentio, a visiting student, and his servant Tranio. Lucentio is totally in love with Bianca from first sight, and her dad says that she needs a teacher. So boom, he sweeps in disguise because this is Shakespeare, duh, and pretends to be a teacher to get closer to her and get her to love him. Meanwhile, Hortensio, who is one of Bianca's suitors, finds Petruchio, who is in search of a rich wife, and he says, "Boy, do I have an offer for you," and gets him to court Cat. You can see why this plot would translate so well to a high school romance setting simply because parents make rules. That's exactly the route that 10 Things took. Our main characters, Cat and Bianca Stratford, because Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, are a senior and sophomore at Padua High School, and their dad has the same basic rules for them. No stinky, smelly teenage boys for Bianca unless Cat gets one first. Here's where the iconic Shakespearean bet comes in. Joey, this movie's Hortensio, pays the Australian bad boy Patrick, this movie's Petruchio, to take out Cat so that he can take out Bianca. And who's this movie's Lucentio? None other than rom-com veteran Joseph Gordon-Levitt. 3 out of 5 of these characters follow the exact same character arc and story of The Taming of the Shrew, with Cameron being Bianca's teacher to get her to fall in love with him, Joey using Patrick to date Cat so that he can take out Bianca, and Bianca falling in love with the underdog instead of one of her cockier suitors. The other 2 characters, though, follow a very different trajectory than their Shakespearean counterparts, Cat especially. In the play, she's trained by Petruchio to be a submissive and polite little housewife, but in this movie, she keeps her spunk all the way to the last scene where Patrick apologizes and they make up. And Patrick in the movie is a brooding rebel bad boy with a heart of gold who wins Cat's love organically, if you don't count the bet, instead of being verbally abusive and manipulative like in the play. Michael, who's Cameron's best friend, who's meant to be this movie's Tranio, also definitely serves his purpose as the comedic relief, wingman, just like in the play, but he has a whole actual Shakespeare lover boy side plot. Like, he gets the girl, but at the cost of cosplaying the bard. These changes, although they technically knock the movie down on the Shakespeare scale, were very much needed in order to make a successful rom-com where the audience could root for Cat and Patrick and have a fun time watching all the side plots in the process. So this movie, despite being the most well-known Shakespeare rom-com adaptation, actually doesn't follow the story very closely at all, besides the major plot points, earning it a 4 out of 10 on the Shakespeare scale. But my goodness, does this movie rom-com. It's set in high school, the nice guy gets the girl, the mean girl breaks her walls down and falls in love, and gets to go to her dream college. The cocky and conceited pretty boy jock gets what he deserves at the big school dance. These are all standard and very welcome tropes to make the romance of this movie even more sweet and giddy because there's so much in the way of both of the relationships. There are points where you think it's completely over between both couples, but then all is well after the grandest of grand gestures that a high school guy could ever do for his girl. A flash mob. When Patrick grabbed that stadium mic and the legendary trumpet tune of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You played, lives were changed. And on top of that grand gesture, the love confession scene in this movie goes down in history. I hate it when you're not around, and the fact that you didn't call. But mostly, I hate that I don't hate you. Not even close, not even a little, not even at all. And they say Cat's sonnet to Patrick is the perfect Shakespearean tie-in that makes this movie a fantastic adaptation. Not so much of the actual play that it's based off of, but of what Shakespeare represents, and again, how he teaches us how to think. In my opinion, 10 Things I Hate About You is a masterclass of Shakespeare adaptation for the rom-com genre. It knows exactly who its audience is, with Mr. Stratford being terrified of teenage pregnancy, Cat's witty remarks and general cool girl personality for young girls to idolize, and a cast full of boys being entirely swoon-worthy in their own way. Being that this movie is the first to be released out of the 3 that I've analyzed, it's so clear how the other 2 movies that came after it took inspiration from the silly or sweet rom-com aspects of this movie that make it stand the test of time. Viola scandalously flashing the crowd like Cat does to get Patrick out of detention, Duke and Benedict having a sensitive side like Patrick does. The list goes on, but what makes it more interesting is that the core common thread to all of these movies is that they're adaptations of the more whimsical and quirky Shakespeare plays, resulting in the creation of equally quirky romantic comedies. With the perfect mix of heartwarming romance, drama, comedy, and poetry, 10 Things I Hate About You earns a glorious 9 out of 10 on the rom-com scale. and a stunning 14 out of 20 in total. Each of these 3 movies takes Shakespeare plays and uses them as a jumping off point to create new stories that modernize his legendary and timeless tropes for the screen, resulting in romantic comedy movies made over a span of 20 years that shine brighter than other rom-coms released over the same time. However, after rating all of them on my incredibly scientific scale of adaptation, the best romantic comedy movie adaptation of a Shakespeare play is 10 Things I Hate About You, with the highest score of 14 out of 20. This is editing Julia here. I don't know what happened, but 10 Things I Hate About You got a 5 on the Shakespeare scale and a 9 on the rom-com scale, making a 14. But I think I said 4 earlier. So, this is clarifying that. Okay. Again, it's not most accurate to the plot of the play it's based off of, but as we've come to find, the stereotypical romance and some comedy elements actually stem from Shakespeare as well. So it would make sense that the rom-commiest movie is also the most Shakespearean. Over time though, even if it's just the 24 years between 10 Things and Anyone But You, Shakespeare's pieces became even more of a novelty, and movies based off of his plays have chosen to make it abundantly clear that they are in fact inspired by a classic piece of theater. Which is why Anyone But You just fully puts quotes from the play it's based off of and from Shakespeare himself throughout the movie. Over time, I feel like things have been dumbed down in a way, for lack of a better word, which I find kind of disheartening. I do think that Shakespeare can be really inaccessible and, like many other Eurocentric art forms, be made to seem higher class or more intellectual or just straight up better than more cultural art of any kind. But I also really love that the other 2 rom-coms only mention their theatrical inspiration within the credits, so that if you don't know the Shakespeare that it's based off of, you're still met with a really great standalone, feel-good romantic movie. In fact, I'd like to see more rom-com adaptations of the same 3 wacky plays. Set Shakespeare in college next, put him in Mexico, or online, or make it gay. I don't know. I just want to see all of the possible retellings of these plays and more, because the arts were meant to be intertwined and reimagined. As someone currently working towards a theater arts degree and an aspiring playwright and screenplay writer, if no one else will keep the Shakespearean rom-coms alive, just give me like 15 years and then I got you. New classics will be born. So my major takeaway from all of this intense research is that you can compare these movies to their original Shakespeare and to each other, but what results shouldn't be a closed case. Revisit your favorite rom-coms and take a chance on new ones. Read and write some sonnets for yourself and others. Analyze characters and connect them back to people or characters of the past, because history is always repeating itself. And please, please don't go flashing people at your high school. By reconnecting with the work that inspired so many movies in this genre that I know and love, I've gained new understanding of the power of a good plot and noteworthy character traits in any genre. So, in the words of William Shakespeare, but more importantly Channing Tatum as Duke Orsino in She's the Man, be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. And in watching all 3 of these romantic comedies and reading the plays that inspired them, I have certainly had greatness thrust upon me. And they say